The unforgiving Arizona sun doesn't judge. It beats down on the righteous and the damned all the same. In the dusty town of Redemption, Gulch, Leona Wainwright was judged to be the latter. Cast out pregnant and carrying a secret that could burn the town to cinders, she was nothing more than a ghost haunting the fringes of a society that had discarded her. But on the precipice of a brutal injustice orchestrated by the very man who broke her heart, this forgotten woman would be faced with a choice that would echo across the mesas, written not in gunpowder and glory, but in the silent courage of a mother's heart. This is the story of how a quiet act of defiance saved 2 lives and challenged the very soul of the West. The dust of Redemption Gulch settled on everything, a fine red powder that coated Leona Wainwright's soul as surely as it did the hem of her patched calico dress. It was the dust of judgment, kicked up by the boots of men who tipped their hats to Bartholomew Cole, and the hooves of horses that pulled the carriages of women who whispered behind their hands when Leona passed. She lived in a small clapboard cabin, a mile out of town, squatting on a parcel of land no one else wanted, where a once proud creek had surrendered to the sun, leaving only a scar of cracked mud and thirsty stones. Her world had shrunk to the 4 walls of this cabin and the ever-expanding curve of her own belly. It was a constant living reminder of Clayton Cole, of whispered promises under a canopy of stars, and of the cold final handshake from his father Bartholomew that had severed her from her past life. Bartholomew Cole was more than a man. He was the bedrock of Redemption Gulch. His Seabar Sea Ranch sprawled across the valley, controlling the water, the cattle, and the very livelihoods of its citizens. His son Clayton was the town's golden prince, and Leona, the daughter of a simple blacksmith, had been his scandalous secret. Now that secret was impossible to hide. Every morning, Leona felt the kick of new life, a flutter that was both a comfort and a condemnation. The townsfolk saw only her shame. They didn't see her resilience, the quiet strength it took to haul water from the town well under their scornful gazes, or the determination with which she tended her small, stubborn vegetable garden, coaxing life from the parched earth. Her father, a good man named Thomas Wainwright, had died of a fever 2 years prior, leaving her with the cabin and a legacy of quiet dignity she clung to like a prayer. He had taught her to read, to be self-reliant, and to understand the language of the land. "Listen to what the wind carries, Leona," he used to say, his hands stained with soot and grease. "It tells more truth than any man in a saloon." Lately the wind carried whispers of trouble, tensions with the Apache, whose ancestral lands the Seabar Sea Ranch was slowly strangling, had grown taut as a bowstring. Bartholomew Cole spoke of them as vermin, a plague to be eradicated. He'd recently hired a new deputy, a man with cold, flat eyes named Garrett, who rode with a brace of pistols and a sneer that seemed permanently affixed to his face. Sheriff Brody, a man whose spine had long since been replaced by Cole's money, simply nodded and signed whatever papers were put in front of him. From her cabin's single dusty window, Leona had a clear view of the dry creek bed and the rocky mesas beyond. It was a lonely vista, but it also offered a unique perspective. She saw things the town didn't. She saw the patrols of Seabar seamen riding further and further into the canyons. She saw the smoke signals from the Apache, once distant and sporadic, now more frequent, like an anxious conversation written on the sky. One late afternoon, as the sun began to bleed across the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, Leona saw something new. 3 wagons, not the usual supply buckboards, trundled out from the Cole Ranch. They weren't heading for town. They were heading for the mouth of the narrow canyon that bordered the creek bed, not a quarter-mile from her cabin. Bartholomew Cole himself led them, flanked by Deputy Garrett and a dozen hard-faced riders. Leona watched her hand, resting protectively on her stomach. They weren't carrying rifles in a way that suggested a patrol. They were unloading something heavy and coiled something that looked like immense spools of thick hemp rope. A flicker of a memory, a story her father once told about trapping wild mustangs, sparked in her mind. They were building a trap, but not for horses. The scale of it was too large, the location too deliberate. She felt a cold dread seep into her bones, a dread that had nothing to do with her own precarious situation. The men worked with a grim efficiency, stringing the ropes between the sturdy cottonwood trees that lined the canyon entrance, camouflaging their work with branches and dust. As twilight deepened into a moonless dark, they finished leaving behind a silent, invisible web of destruction. Bartholomew Cole stood for a long moment, staring into the dark maw of the canyon, a look of predatory satisfaction on his face. Then they rode away, leaving 2 sentries hidden in the rocks. Leona's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the core that this trap was not for an animal, it was for a man. And whatever soul was unfortunate enough to wander into that canyon tonight was walking into a nightmare of Cole's design. The wind picked up, rattling the loose pane of her window, and it seemed to whisper a single dire word: ambush. Sleep offered Leona no escape. Her dreams were tangled webs of rope and shadow, the phantom cries of a child echoing in the darkness. She woke before dawn, the air in the small cabin thick and cold. The first thing she did was go to the window. The sky was a bruised purple, the stars beginning to fade. In the rocks across the creek bed, she could just make out the silhouette of one of Cole's sentries, a motionless statue of waiting malice. All day, an oppressive silence hung over the valley. The usual sounds, the distant lowing of cattle, the cry of a hawk, were absent, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Leona forced herself to perform her daily tasks. She kneaded dough for bread, her knuckles pushing into the flour with a frantic energy. She mended a tear in her father's old shirt, which she now wore as a smock, her needle piercing the fabric in a steady rhythmic stab. With every stitch, her mind raced. Who were they waiting for? The whispers in town were of an Apache warrior they called Nantan, or the Ghost. He was a specter, a Chiricahua leader who slipped through Cole's patrols like smoke, a symbol of defiance that infuriated the cattle baron. Cole had put a bounty on his head, but Nantan was too cunning. He never took the same trail twice, never fell for the simple traps of baited supply wagons or false waterholes. This new trap, however, was different. It was patient, silent, and overwhelmingly final. As the afternoon sun climbed to its zenith, beating down with a relentless fury, Leona saw Clayton Cole ride out from town. He was alone. He didn't ride with the swagger of his father's men. His shoulders were slumped, his handsome face etched with a conflict he tried to hide beneath the brim of his hat. He rode to the sentry post and dismounted. Leona couldn't hear their words, but she could read the language of their bodies. Clayton's gestures were hesitant, questioning. The sentries were sharp, dismissive. After a few minutes, Clayton mounted his horse and rode slowly back towards the ranch, a man trapped in a life he hadn't chosen, but was too weak to escape. Seeing him twisted a knot of old pain and fresh anger in Leona's gut. He was the father of her child, yet he was a stranger, a ghost from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. He had chosen his father's power over her love, his inheritance, over his own blood. And now he was complicit in this cold-blooded manhunt. Later that day, driven by a thirst for knowledge that outweighed her fear, Leona took her water bucket and began the long walk towards the town well. It was a risk, But she had to hear something, anything. As she passed the turn-off to the coal ranch, she saw Deputy Garrett and 2 of the Seabar Sea men sharing a flask in the thin shade of a mesquite tree. They were laughing, their voices loud and cruel. She kept her head down, hoping they wouldn't notice her. "He'll come," Garrett slurred, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Cole's got it figured. The moon's new tonight, and the old trail to the high springs goes right through that canyon. The ghost needs water, just like anyone else. And when he's in the net, one of the others asked, his voice eager. Garrett's laugh was a dry, ugly sound. "Then we let him hang there for a while. Let the sun soften him up. Mr. Cole don't want him dead. Not right away. He wants him for the trial. Wants to make an example of him. Show everyone what happens when you defy Bartholomew Cole." "What about the bounty?" "The bounty's for his head," Garrett sneered. "Cole will get his show. Then we'll get our money. Everyone wins, except the redskin." They laughed again, and the sound curdled the air. Leona walked faster, her knuckles white around the bucket handle. It wasn't just a capture. It was a spectacle of torture and humiliation, a piece of theater designed to break the spirit of the Apache and cement Cole's dominance. Her mind reeled. They were going to leave him hanging wounded and exposed until his will was broken. When she returned to her cabin, the shadows were lengthening once more. The dread had solidified into a cold, hard stone in her stomach. She looked out at the canyon entrance, at the silent, waiting trees. Her father had taught her about snares and traps, how a simple knot and a bit of tension could hold a creature 10 times its own weight. The web they had woven was a masterpiece of engineering and cruelty. She thought of the unseen warrior, Nantan, a man fighting for his land, for his people, a man walking towards a fate he couldn't possibly anticipate. And she, Leona Wainwright, the town pariah, was the only one who knew. The secret felt like a living thing squirming in her conscience. To do nothing was to be complicit, to be no better than Clayton, standing by while his father committed unspeakable acts. But to do something that was madness. She was one woman, pregnant and alone, against the most powerful force in the valley. They would crush her without a second thought. As darkness fell complete and suffocating under the new moon, Leona lit a single candle. Its small flame flickered, casting long dancing shadows on the cabin walls. In the wavering light, she caught her reflection in the dusty window pane. A tired, drawn face, and the unmistakable silhouette of a life growing within. The kick in her belly was stronger this time, a sudden, insistent thump. It felt less like a reminder of her shame, and more like a demand for courage. The wind howled outside, and it no longer sounded like a whisper, but a scream. The night was absolute. Without the moon, the landscape dissolved into an abyss of black on black, the mazes indistinguishable from the starless sky. Leona sat by her window. The candle long since extinguished her eyes, straining to pierce the oppressive dark. Every rustle of the wind in the sagebrush, every distant yip of a coyote sent a jolt through her nerves. The world was holding its breath, and so was she. Hours passed. The cold of the desert night seeped through the cracks in the cabin walls. Leona wrapped her father's worn wool blanket around her shoulders, the faint scent of wood smoke, and leather a comforting ghost from her past. She was about to give up her vigil, to succumb to the exhaustion that gnawed at her, when a flicker of movement caught her eye. It wasn't a sound, but a void. A disturbance in the seamless dark. A shape darker than the surrounding shadows was moving with a fluid grace along the edge of the creek bed. It was a man on foot, his steps so silent he seemed to float over the treacherous rock-strewn ground. The ghost. Nantan? He moved with an unnerving confidence, a predator in his own domain, yet he was walking unknowingly into the jaws of a trap far more insidious than any beast's. Leona's breath caught in her throat. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She wanted to scream, to throw a rock, to create any sound that would warn him away. But the sentries were out there, hidden and alert. A single cry would seal her own fate as surely as it would his. Nantan reached the mouth of the canyon. He paused, his head tilted, listening to a language only he could understand, the language of the wind, the rocks, the night. For a terrifying moment, Leona thought he sensed it. He took a half-step back, his body tensing. The sentries, wherever they were, must have been holding their breath too. But then he continued forward, melting into the deeper blackness of the canyon entrance. The sound that followed was not the sharp crack of a rifle, but a sudden violent series of thuds and snaps. It was the sound of immense tension being released. A whoosh of heavy rope slicing through the air, the splintering of trigger branches, and then a strangled cry of surprise and pain. It was followed by a crash as a massive weighted net thrown from the canyon walls dropped from the sky. Silence. Then a man's grunt, filled with fury and effort, and the sickening taut stretching of thick hemp rope as he fought against his bonds. Lights flared. 2 lanterns held by the sentries suddenly illuminated the scene in a sickly yellow glow. There at the canyon mouth was the trap. It was a brutal, brilliant design. Multiple nets weighted with heavy stones had fallen, tangling him, hoisting him partially off the ground, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. Nantan was a tall, powerful man, his bare arms corded with muscle, his long black hair matted with dust. He thrashed against the ropes, not with panic, but with a focused rage, a knife appearing in his hand as he tried to slash at the thick cords. But Bartholomew Cole had planned for that. The primary net was woven with fine wire, invisible in the dark, which snagged the knife and tore it from the warrior's grasp. And then Leona saw it. The reason he had hesitated. The reason he had walked into the trap when his instincts screamed at him to flee. Strapped to his back in a cradleboard was a baby. The impact of the trap had thrown the cradleboard to the side, and it was now dangling precariously held only by a single leather strap. The baby jolted awake, let out a piercing, terrified wail that sliced through the night and straight into Leona's heart. The cry of that child changed everything. This wasn't about a faceless warrior or land disputes anymore. This was about a father desperately trying to protect his child, ensnared in a web of hatred. The warrior, hearing his baby's cry, stopped struggling for a moment. He twisted his body, trying to see the cradleboard, a raw, guttural sound of anguish escaping his lips. He renewed his efforts, no longer fighting for his own freedom, but for the small, helpless life that depended on him. The 2 sentries approached cautiously, rifles raised. They were followed by Deputy Garrett and 2 more C-Bar C men, who must have been waiting nearby. "Got him!" Garrett crowed, his voice filled with triumph. "The ghost is caught." He strode forward, holding his lantern high. His eyes fell on the cradleboard, and his sneer widened. "Well, look at that." He brought his papoose. Nantan spat a stream of Apache words at them, his voice a low, dangerous growl. His dark eyes burned with a hatred so pure it was almost tangible. "Don't matter what you say," Savage Garrett said, prodding the warrior's shoulder with the barrel of his rifle. "You'll learn to speak our language soon enough. Mr. Cole is a patient teacher." He looked at the crying baby. "Shut that thing up." One of the men reached out to grab the cradleboard, but Nantan surged against the ropes with such ferocious strength that the man stumbled back in fear. The warrior was wounded, Leona could see a dark stain spreading on his buckskin leggings where a sharpened stake part of the trap had pierced his thigh. "Leave him be," Garrett commanded. "The boss's orders. Let him hang. Let him watch his brat squall. The fight'll be gone from him by sunrise. We'll come back for him then." They checked the knots on the anchoring ropes, ensuring their prisoner was secure. The baby's cries continued sharp and desperate, echoing off the canyon walls. The men seemed immune to the sound. They laughed, shared a joke, and then retreated back to their post in the rocks, leaving one man on watch. The main lanterns were extinguished, and the scene was plunged back into darkness, save for the single lantern left with the lone guard. The world shrank to that one small circle of light. In its center, a man hung suspended between earth and sky, a wounded animal in a snare. And beside him, a baby cried for a comfort that could not be given. From her window, Leona watched her body trembling. Her own child kicked within her, a silent communion with the terror unfolding in the dark. The baby's cries were a physical blow, each one a needle in her soul. She saw the father, his head bowed in the dim light, his body gone still. He wasn't struggling anymore. He was listening to the cries of his child, defeated not by ropes and wire, but by his own powerlessness. In that moment, Leona Wainwright made a choice. It wasn't a choice born of logic or reason. It was a primal, visceral decision that rose from the depths of her being, from the fierce, nascent instinct of a mother. They had called her an outcast, a sinner, a ghost in her own life. Tonight she would embrace the name. She would become a shadow in the darkness and undo this evil, for the man in the net and for the child whose cries were now the only sound in the desolate, unforgiving night. The guard, a lanky cowhand named Peters, settled in for a long night. He propped his rifle against a boulder, pulled a flask from his coat, and took a long swig. The baby's cries had subsided into exhausted, intermittent whimpers that were somehow more heartbreaking than the full-throated wails. The sound grated on his nerves. From her window, Leona watched his every move, her mind a whirlwind of frantic planning. She couldn't just walk out there. Peters would shoot her on sight and ask questions later. She needed darkness. She needed a distraction. She needed a weapon. Her eyes scanned the meager contents of her cabin. There were no guns. Her father had owned a hunting rifle, but she had sold it for flour and salt pork months ago. Her gaze fell upon the hearth. Next to the stack of firewood was her father's old skinning knife. It was a simple tool, its wooden handle worn smooth from years of use. But the blade was high-quality steel, and she kept it razor-sharp for cutting hides and portioning meat. It felt heavy and purposeful in her hand. Next, she needed to create darkness. The guard's lantern was the biggest obstacle. It cast a perfect circle of visibility around the trap. Her eyes darted around the room again, landing on a small cloth sack of dried beans. An idea desperate and dangerous began to form. She waited. An hour passed, then another. The night grew deeper, colder. Inside her the baby was still, as if sensing the tension that held its mother rigid. Leona's own fear was a physical thing, a cold knot in her stomach that made her want to retch. Every instinct screamed at her to bar the door and hide. She thought of Clayton, of his weakness, of his father's monstrous cruelty. She thought of the whispers and the stares in town. What did she have left to lose? Her reputation was already in tatters. Her future was a terrifying unknown. But if she did nothing, if she let that baby suffer and that man be tortured, the shame of her cowardice would be a far heavier burden than any bastard child. Around 2 a.m, Peters was beginning to doze. His head nodded forward, jerking back up every few minutes. The whimpers from the cradleboard had ceased. The infant had cried itself to sleep. Nantan hung limp and motionless in the nets. Now was the time. Leona slipped out of her cabin, the skinning knife tucked into the waistband of her dress. She didn't use the door, which had a tendency to creak. Instead, she slipped out the back window, lowering herself silently to the ground. The cold air was a shock against her warm skin. Barefoot, she moved with a caution her father had taught her when they tracked deer, placing each foot deliberately testing the ground before putting her weight down. She didn't approach the canyon directly. Instead, she circled wide, using the deep shadows of the creek bed as cover. The rocks were sharp against the soles of her feet, but she barely felt the pain. Her entire being was focused on the small pool of light and the man dozing within it. She found what she was looking for, a small rise about 50 feet to the guard's left, littered with loose stones and scrub brush. It was a perfect vantage point. She crept up the incline on her hands and knees, the coarse fabric of her dress catching on thorns. From her pocket, she pulled a single dried bean. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was all she had. Her plan wasn't to hurt the guard, but to manipulate the light. Her heart felt like it would explode from her chest. She took a deep, steadying breath, aimed for the glass of the lantern, and threw the bean with all her might. It was a wild hope, a prayer offered to the night. The bean sailed through the air and struck the lantern's glass chimney with a sharp tink. Peters jolted awake, his head snapping up. "Who's there?" he yelled, his voice cracking. He grabbed his rifle, scrambling to his feet and peering into the darkness in the direction of the sound. He was looking directly away from her. Leona didn't hesitate. This was her only chance. While his attention was diverted, she scrambled down from the rise and sprinted silent as a moth across the open ground towards the canyon entrance. She didn't run towards the prisoner, but towards the thick cottonwood tree on the far side, the one that served as the main anchor for the trap's rigging. She threw herself behind the thick trunk, just as Peters satisfied that the noise was just a rock fall, or an animal turned back around. He muttered a curse, took another pull from his flask, and settled back down, his back now mostly turned to the anchor tree where Leona hid. She pressed her cheek against the rough bark, her lungs burning her body, trembling with adrenaline. She was in. She was inside the circle of danger. 10 feet away, the Apache warrior hung in the net. His head was up now. In the dim, flickering light of the lantern, she saw his eyes. They were fixed on her. There was no surprise in them, no gratitude, only a piercing, wary intensity. He had seen her entire approach. He had watched her, silent and judging. For a moment, she faltered under his gaze. Who was she to him? A white woman, one of the people who had stolen his land, murdered his kin, and now strung him up like an animal. Why would he trust her? Why shouldn't he think this was just some other, crueler part of the trap? The baby stirred in its cradle board, letting out a soft, sleepy sigh. That sound was her answer. She wasn't doing this for his trust or his gratitude. She was a mother saving a child. She met the warrior's gaze, held it, and then gave a slow, deliberate nod. She pressed a finger to her lips, then held up the skinning knife, letting the blade catch a faint gleam of lantern light. His expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, understanding, perhaps passed through his dark eyes. He remained perfectly still, a silent accomplice in his own escape. Leona took another deep breath, the smell of dust and fear filling her senses. The vigil was over. The time for desperation had begun. The ropes were thick as her wrist, woven from heavy hemp that smelled of dust and tar. They were drawn taut, humming, with the strain of the warrior's dead weight. Leona pressed her ear to the cottonwood's trunk, listening. Peters was humming a tuneless, drunken dirge to himself, his focus entirely on his flask. Leona knew she couldn't just hack at the main anchor rope. The sudden release of tension would make a sound like a gunshot, and the whole contraption would come crashing down, possibly injuring Nantan and the baby even more severely. Her father had taught her about knots and rigging when he'd helped the livery build a new hayloft. "Never fight the whole weight," he'd said. "Fight the small pieces. Undermine the foundation." The trap wasn't a single net, but a series of them, hoisted by a complex system of pulleys and counterweights attached to different trees. The main anchor rope in front of her held the primary tension. If she could release it slowly, she might be able to lower him enough to attack the other ropes, holding him fast. The skinning knife was wickedly sharp. She didn't saw at the rope. She began to slice at it, fibre by fibre, shaving it away in thin slivers. It was painstaking, agonizingly slow work. Each scrape of the blade against the hemp sounded like a thunderclap in her own ears. Her hands, slick with sweat, struggled to keep their grip on the smooth wooden handle. The muscles in her arm and shoulder burned with the effort. Nantan watched her, his body unnervingly still. He seemed to understand her strategy, subtly shifting his weight whenever she paused, testing the ropes, helping in the only way he could. He was an active participant in his liberation, a silent partner in this conspiracy of two. After what felt like an eternity, more than half the rope's thickness was gone. It began to groan and stretch, the fibers popping with small, sharp reports. Peters stopped his humming. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, turning his head. Leona froze, flattening herself against the tree, her body a shield for her work. Her heart stopped. Peters stared into the darkness for a long moment, then shrugged, attributing the sound to the trap settling. He took another long drink. Leona let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It was now or never. With a final desperate prayer, she put all her weight into the knife, slicing through the remaining strands. There was a loud thwang as the rope snapped. The main net dropped a good 5 feet with a violent jolt. Nantan grunted as the sudden fall slammed him against the canyon wall, but his feet were now touching the ground. The trap still held him, but the killing tension was gone. Peters leaped to his feet. "Hey!" He raised his rifle, squinting at the sagging net. He saw the warrior on the ground and the severed rope hanging limp from the branch above. What in damnation? He started forward, away from his post and towards the net, his back now completely to Leona. It was the opening she needed. She didn't run towards Nantan. She ran parallel to the canyon wall, a flitting shadow moving towards the next anchor point, a smaller tree 50 feet away. "Stay where you are, Injun!" Peters shouted, fumbling to raise his lantern and rifle at the same time. "I'll shoot! So help me, I'll put a hole in you." Nantan, now with the leverage of the ground beneath him, gave a sudden, powerful heave. He threw his weight against the side of the net, causing the whole structure to swing wildly. It was a deliberate distraction, a selfless act to draw the guard's fire. Peters, startled by the sudden movement, fired his rifle. The shot went wide, the bullet ricocheting off the canyon wall with a high-pitched whine. The muzzle flash and the deafening report gave Leona all the cover she needed. In that moment of blinding light and sound, she reached the second rope. This one was thinner. 2 quick, brutal slashes from her knife, and it parted. Another section of the net fell away. Peters was in a panic now. He knew something was terribly wrong, but he couldn't see his attacker. He spun around, his rifle held ready, his eyes wild. "Who's out there? Show yourself." Leona was already moving again, low to the ground, a wraith in the gloom. Nantan, feeling the net loosen further, began to untangle himself with a speed and dexterity that was breathtaking. He worked at the thick ropes with his fingers, his movements economical and precise. He had one arm free. then a leg. Leona reached the final rope, the one that held the net restraining the cradle board. It was snagged on a rocky outcrop. As she sawed at it, her knife scraped against the rock, the shriek of steel on stone, echoing in the sudden silence. Peters whirled the lantern light, catching her. For a split second, their eyes met across the 20 yards that separated them. His face registered a comical look of disbelief. The pregnant woman, the town outcast. It was impossible. That moment of stunned confusion cost him everything. With a final heave, Nantan tore himself free from the last of the netting. He was no longer a captive, but a force of nature. In 2 silent strides, he closed the distance between himself and the stunned guard. He didn't use a weapon. He simply slammed his shoulder into Peters's chest. The air left the guard's lungs in a great whoosh, and he crumpled to the ground, his rifle clattering on the rocks. Nantan disarmed him in an instant, his movements a blur of controlled violence. He stood over the gasping man, the rifle now in his own hands, a figure of terrifying retribution. Leona rushed to the cradle board, which was tangled in the last of the netting. Her hands trembled as she worked the knots, her sharp knife, carefully slicing the ropes away from the precious cargo. The baby was awake, its large, dark eyes staring up at her not with fear, but with a kind of solemn curiosity. She freed the cradle board and gently lifted it. It was surprisingly light. She turned. Nantan was standing there, watching her, the rifle held loosely in his hand. The guard, Peters, was unconscious on the ground. The immediate danger was over. An impossible gulf of silence and history stood between them. He was an Apache warrior, and she was a white woman. In any other circumstance, they would be mortal enemies. But tonight, they were allies, bound by the web of Bartholomew Cole's cruelty and the innocent life in the cradle board. He was injured. The gash on his thigh was bleeding freely, a dark patch spreading down his leg. He limped as he walked towards her. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes scanning her face, then her swollen belly, and then the cradle board in her arms. He said nothing. He simply held out his arms. Leona carefully passed the cradle board to him. His hands, which had just displayed such brutal efficiency, were impossibly gentle as he took his child. He settled the straps over his shoulder, adjusting the blankets, his weathered face softening with a look of profound love and relief. He murmured something in his own language, a sound that was both a prayer and a lullaby. Then he looked back at her. His gaze was no longer wary or judging. It was something else entirely, something she couldn't quite name. It was respect. He gave her a single sharp nod. Acknowledgement. Gratitude. A debt understood without a word being spoken. The betrayal of Bartholomew Cole's ambush was complete, undone, by the quiet betrayal of a woman he had never even considered a threat. The first hint of dawn was a pale grey line on the eastern horizon. They couldn't stay here. When the sun rose, Cole and his men would return. Nantan gestured with the rifle towards the high country, the rugged, broken land that was his home. But one look at the deep, ragged wound in his thigh told Leona he wouldn't make it far. Not with a baby to carry. He was losing blood, and his steps were already unsteady. "No," Leona said, her voice raspy from disuse. It was the first word spoken between them. He looked at her, his brow furrowed. "Too far," she explained, pointing to his leg. "They will track you." She thought for a moment, her mind racing. The Sebar Sea men knew every major trail, every spring, every pass in this valley. But they didn't know everything. Her father had been a wanderer, a man who preferred the company of rocks and solitude to the gossip of the town. He had shown her his secrets. "Come," she whispered, tugging gently on his arm. "There is a place." He hesitated for only a second. He had seen her courage, her resourcefulness. He had trusted her with his child's life. He would trust her with his own. He gave a short nod and followed. Leona led him away from the canyon, not towards the mountains, but down along the driest part of the creek bed, where the rocks were sharpest and would leave the faintest trail. It was a painful journey. Leona's bare feet were cut and bruised, and Nantan's limp grew more pronounced with every step, his face a stoic mask that barely concealed the agony he was in. But he never faltered his grip on the rifle, and his child unwavering. She led him to a place that looked like nothing more than a sheer cliff face, a dead-end wall of red rock and tangled thorny brush. This was the place her father had called his thinking spot. "Here, where?" she said, pushing aside a thick curtain of desiccated vines. Behind it, almost completely obscured, was a narrow fissure in the rock, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. It was a crack in the world, a place no one would ever find by accident. Inside, the air was cool and damp. The fissure opened into a small hidden grotto, no larger than her cabin. In the center, fed by a slow, constant drip from the porous rock above, was a small pool of crystal-clear water. It was a secret spring, one that never ran dry, even in the worst drought. Nantan stared at the water, his thirsty eyes wide with disbelief. He knelt, checked on his sleeping baby, then plunged his cupped hands into the pool and drank deeply. He looked at Leona, a question in his eyes. "My father found it," she said simply. While he drank, she tore a long strip of cloth from the hem of her already ragged dress. She dipped it in the cool, clean water and gently began to clean the wound on his thigh. It was a nasty gash, deep and crusted with dried blood. He flinched when she touched it, but allowed her to tend to him, his gaze never leaving her face. She packed the wound with moss she scraped from the damp rocks, an old remedy her father had taught her, to stop bleeding, and bound it tightly with the cloth bandage. It was a crude dressing, but it was better than nothing. As she worked, the silence in the grotto was broken only by the steady drip of water and the soft breathing of the baby. The shared danger and the intimate act of tending his wound had forged a strange, powerful bond between them. Nantan finally spoke. His voice was a low rumble, and his English was broken but clear. "Why?" he asked, his dark eyes searching hers. "You are his woman." He gestured vaguely in the direction of the coal ranch. Leona's hands stilled. She looked down, a flush of shame and anger rising in her. "No," she said, her voice hard. "I am not." She met his gaze, and for the first time in months, she spoke her truth aloud to another soul. "His father Cole, he wants you gone. He wants all your people gone." Nantan nodded slowly. "He wants the water," he said. It wasn't a question. "All the water." "Yes," Leona affirmed. He looked at the small pool in the center of the grotto, then at the single drop of water as it fell from the ceiling, creating a tiny ripple. A look of understanding dawned on his face. "He does not know of this place," Nantan stated. "No one does," she replied. Then the warrior did something that changed Leona's understanding of the entire conflict. He reached into a small leather pouch tied to his belt. He was careful, his movements slow, as if what he held was sacred. He pulled out not a weapon or a tool, but a piece of old, cracked hide, folded many times. He carefully unfolded it on a flat rock between them. It was a map. Not a map like any Leona had ever seen, drawn with ink and precise lines. This was a story painted in natural pigments, ochre charcoal and berry juice. It showed the valley, the mountains, the sun and the moon. But at the center of it, there was a complex symbol, a spiral from which blue lines radiated out like the legs of a spider. Nantan pointed a finger at the symbol. "Tuochin," he said. He tapped his chest. "My grandfather's grandfather." Then he pointed to the blue lines. "Nali." He looked at her, searching for the word. "Water," he said. "The water, under the ground, it never sleeps." Leona stared at the map, her breath catching in her throat. Her father had told her stories dismissed by most as campfire tales of a legendary source of water in the valley, a hot spring that fed all the others, a source that could turn the desert green. The Coles had spent a fortune drilling wells trying to find it with no success. "Bartholomew Cole knows of this?" she asked, her voice a whisper. Nantan shook his head. "No, he knows. I can find it. My father taught me the signs, the rock, the plants. Cole captures me. He makes me show him." The warrior's eyes hardened. "He gets the heart spring. He owns the world. All other ranches, they die. All people leave. Only Cole." Suddenly the full monstrous scope of Bartholomew Cole's ambition became clear. This wasn't just about grazing rights or prejudice. It was about absolute power. He hadn't just wanted to capture Nantan to make an example of him. He wanted to torture him, to break him, to wring from him the one secret that would give him total control over the entire territory. He wanted to bleed the valley dry, leaving himself as its sole king. The debt was no longer just Leona's. It was the land's. This warrior, this father, wasn't just the ghost who defied the Seabar Sea. He was the guardian of the valley's lifeblood. The baby, whose name Leona still didn't know, began to fuss. Nantan gently lifted the cradleboard and rocked it, murmuring to his child. Leona watched them, a fierce, protective feeling swelling inside her. The child in her womb kicked a mirror of the life she had just helped to save. "My name is Leona," she said softly. The warrior looked up from his child. He met her eyes, and for the first time, a faint, weary smile touched his lips. "I am Goji," he said, "the one they call Nantan." He looked down at the baby. "And this is Asha." The name meant she who is hopeful, in a language she did not know, but in that moment she understood it perfectly. He refolded the precious map and tucked it away. The sun would be up now. Cole would have found the empty trap. His fury would be a thing of legend. And soon that fury would have a name. Her name. The rage of Bartholomew Cole was a palpable force, a heat that radiated from him as he stood before the sabotaged trap. The severed ropes, the unconscious form of his guard, Peter's the empty mocking net. It was all an impossible, infuriating insult. "Find him!" Cole roared, his voice echoing in the morning stillness. "I want every rider, every man with a gun, sweep the canyons. I want that savage's head, and I want the fool who helped him." Deputy Garrett, eager to redeem himself, pointed to the ground near the anchor tree. There, snagged on a thorny bush, was a small, damning piece of evidence, a scrap of faded calico cloth torn from the hem of a dress. Cole snatched it. He stared at the simple pattern, his mind working furiously. There was only one woman in Redemption Gulch who lived this far out, only one woman with the audacity and the motive of a scorned lover. His eyes cold and sharp as ice picks turned towards the small, weathered cabin silhouetted against the rising sun. Wainwright. He spat the name like a curse. Leona had left the grotto an hour before dawn. Goji Nantan was safe for now. The hidden spring would sustain him, and the fissure was a perfect hiding place. He had urged her to flee with him into the high country, but she had shaken her head. This was her home. Her child would be born here. Running was not in her nature. She would face the consequences of her actions. She had returned to her cabin not as a victim, but as a woman who had finally claimed her own power. She was sitting at her small kitchen table, calmly drinking a cup of chicory coffee when they arrived. Bartholomew Cole did not knock. He kicked the door off its flimsy hinges, the wood splintering inward. He stormed in, flanked by Garrett, and to Leona's surprise, his son Clayton. Cole's face was a thundercloud of fury. He threw the scrap of calico onto the table. It landed next to her cup. "You," he seethed, his voice low and dangerous. "You did this. You freed him." Leona didn't flinch. She looked up from her cup, her gaze steady, and met his eyes. "He was a father," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "Protecting his child, you were going to torture him." The simplicity and truth of her statement seemed to enrage him further. "He is a savage, an animal, and you are a traitor to your own kind." "Where is he?" "Gone," she said. "Liar." Cole took a step forward, his hand raised as if to strike her. "Father, no." Clayton moved, suddenly placing himself between his father and Leona. It was the first time Leona had ever seen him defy the older man. His face was pale, his hands trembling, but he stood his ground. "Get out of my way, boy," Bartholomew snarled. "This doesn't concern you." "It does concern me," Clayton said, his voice shaking but gaining strength. He looked at Leona, at her swollen belly, and a dam of guilt and regret finally broke within him. "Sheriff Brody is on his way. The whole town will be here soon. Are you going to strike a pregnant woman in front of everyone, Father? A woman carrying your own grandchild?" The words hung in the air more explosive than any gunshot. Bartholomew Cole froze his face, a mask of stunned disbelief. Garrett's jaw dropped. "What did you say?" Cole whispered, his voice dangerously soft. "You heard me," Clayton said, his voice ringing with a newfound conviction. "The child is mine. I am the father. I was a coward. I let you send her away. I let you shame her. But I will not let you harm her." Bartholomew looked from his son's defiant face to Leona's calm, unyielding expression, and he saw the truth. He saw the foundation of his power built on intimidation, and a carefully crafted image of respectability beginning to crumble. This was a scandal he couldn't bury, a truth he couldn't buy. At that moment, Sheriff Brody and a crowd of curious townsfolk arrived, drawn by the commotion. They saw it all: the shattered door, the enraged cattle baron, his defiant son, and the quiet, pregnant woman at the center of the storm. "What's going on here, Mr. Cole?" Sheriff Brody asked, his usual deference replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Before Cole could answer, a flash of brilliant light caught everyone's eye. High on the distant mesa, the one that overlooked the entire valley, something was reflecting the morning sun. A dazzling rhythmic pulse of light. Flash, 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 flash. Leona knew what it was. Goji. He was safe. He was watching. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise, a signal that he held the secret of the water, the life of the valley, and that he had not been defeated. He was a ghost they would never catch. Bartholomew Cole saw the signal too. He understood its meaning instantly. The map, the secret of the heart spring, was gone. Lost. His grand ambition, his dream of absolute control had vanished with the warrior Leona had freed. He looked at Leona, and for the first time, he saw her not as a discarded girl, but as the architect of his defeat. He had been undone, not by a rival rancher or a gunslinger, but by a quiet woman he had underestimated, and a son who had finally found his spine. His fury collapsed into a hollow, empty rage. He had lost. Without a word, he turned and pushed through the crowd, a king without a kingdom, his power broken not by violence, but by the irrefutable truth. Leona Wainwright stood in the doorway of her broken home, her hand resting on her belly. The townsfolk looked at her now, not with scorn, but with a new, grudging respect. She was no longer the outcast. She was the woman who faced down Bartholomew Cole and won. She had freed a warrior, saved a child, and in doing so had liberated herself. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, as she felt the kick of life within her, it felt full of hope. So stands the story of Leona Wainwright, a testament to the fact that the greatest acts of courage in the Old West weren't always measured by the speed of a draw or the roar of a rifle. Sometimes, true strength was found in the quiet resolve of a pregnant woman with a skinning knife. A woman who chose compassion over cruelty and justice over fear. Leona's choice to free Goji and his daughter Asha didn't just save 2 lives. It saved the soul of a valley, proving that even in the dust and desperation of a place called Redemption, Gulch Redemption itself was possible. It's a reminder that the most powerful force in the untamed frontier was never greed or hatred, but the unbreakable, unwavering heart of a mother. If this story of quiet defiance and unexpected courage resonated with you, please help our channel grow. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates a different kind of Western tale, and most importantly, subscribe for more stories from the forgotten corners of history. Your support allows us to continue bringing these powerful narratives to light. Thank you for listening.